I really enjoyed the last talk. That was fantastic. And picking up on the thread of paper prototypes, sketches, sketching out your narrative or your story, you're going to get some hot tips on exactly how to do that in this talk as well. So thank you for that setup. So I am a game designer and a product creator, creative director, and now most of what I do is coach startups and global brands as they bring ideas to life. So I want to ask you a question first. We're going to come back to this at the end of the talk. What do you think is the #1 gamification mistake that even smart entrepreneurs make when they're bringing their ideas to life, when they want to build a hit? Take a guess and tell me, don't validate enough. That's a great one. Type in your answers there in the chat. Keep typing. Yes, there's all kinds of great stuff. Keep going, guys. While you're typing, I'm going to tell you a story. I want you to imagine what it would be like if you had an always-on AI friend in your pocket you could talk to anytime, who understood you better than anyone else in the world. What would that be like? Well, there was a team of brilliant and well-funded founders who decided to find out and build that. They're Russian computer scientists paired with great PR. They raised many millions of dollars from top-tier VC funding. They had great PR, a very successful launch, millions of downloads. They started to generate a fast-growing community. There were even spin-off groups. But the app had low engagement and a lack of clarity, and it was a big, fancy, expensive, leaky bucket. Perhaps you've had an experience like this, or you've seen something like this. So what's going on there? Well, there's a lot of different reasons. But one of the things that became very clear is there is an opaque mental model for the app. What is this? It's a sensitive replica. Oh, well, it could be a risk-taking replica. This was what they had when we were working together. Oh, it could be a spontaneous replica. You could build this chatbot. People started saying, what is this, a sex toy or a therapist? I don't know what this is. And we'd say, oh, it could be anything. But it turns out that's a really hard way to ship a successful product. So before we started working together, the team, who are brilliant people, decided, well, engagement low, let's add some points and badges. That should work. And of course, it did work for a while, but not long term. And more importantly, it did not help them figure out who the app was really for. It didn't help them focus on the right audience. I love this quote. Mike Tyson, the boxer, says, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And anyone who's worked in a startup knows this. How many of you can relate to this quote? I know I can. So what did we do? We brought game thinking into this brilliant team. We started by connecting with a narrow slice of our audience, not trying to please everybody, but really identifying and finding a hot core super fan who really needed the app, who wasn't just casually curious, but had a real unmet need. Using that knowledge, we clarified the mental model into something that was mental health support. And we designed a compelling customer journey with easy to do tasks that would take them through each day to help them drive engagement. So what do you think happened after we did that? Well, we got a lot of success. Retention went up. The ratings on the App Store went up, as you can see here, and revenue went up. We also introduced in-app purchases, and that was a huge part of it. As a designer, the business model is foundational in thinking about what you're going to build. So that was a big success. I'm Amy Jo Kim. I've written a couple of books. I'm a longtime game and product designer and a startup and team coach. I work with startups, game studios, and global brands. You've probably heard of some of the products I've worked on. Now, I've worked on hundreds of products in my life, and I've shipped with a team dozens and dozens of products. But interestingly, a subset of what I worked on turned into massive hits. eBay, the online marketplace, UO, Ultima Online, massively multiplayer RPG, Rock Band. Tell me if you've played or heard of any of these games in the chat. The Sims. I was on the original Sims design team. Netflix. I helped Netflix fix their onboarding. Covet Fashion, which spawned the game Design Home. Huge mobile hit. Happify, digital mental health app. Huge hit now, 7 years in the making, as is true with most hits. Takes a long time. Tonal, the intelligent home gym. We were struggling, but COVID made Tonal totally take off. And Replica, the AI mental health chatbot I told you about. What was different about these products? What was it? Each of these innovative hits managed to build engagement, long-term engagement, something that takes you past a few weeks from the ground up. And you can too. That's what I'm here to show you about today. Netflix, yeah, I know. I'm using Netflix too. So I have a treat for you. I'd like you to take one moment now. I have a handout for you. If you go to gamethinking.io/GEU2020, you will get a handout. I want you to copy it. It's a Google Doc, not a PDF, so it's actually useful. You can share it with your team. And I'm going to teach you things today that you can reinforce and take away with you and show to your team and use in that handout. There you go. And it's a CAP, GEU. So it might require the caps. There you go. So this is what the handout looks like. All right, so back to that number one gamification mistake. Your answers, by the way, were very, very excellent. Validation, rough play testing, huge issue. But here's another issue. What happened with Replica? Replica was using mechanics and nudges without providing or designing any kind of compelling journey or coherent mental model. I see this mistake all the time. Have you ever seen this mistake? Have you ever made this mistake? Tell me in the chat. This mistake is what we fix, and what the tools that you're going to learn today will let you fix as well. Here's how you do it. You start with discover. This is a step a lot of people miss, but it's hugely important. Linus Pauling, the great scientist, likes to say the best way to have a good idea is to have lots of ideas. So many gamification projects have too little time, and you build the thing instead of build the right thing. Well, how do you build the right thing? One of the best ways to do it, and I have seen this up close and personal in game studios, at global brand teams, and at startups, at the ones that succeed, okay, is to use a version of stage gate theory. This is a very well-established corporate innovation theory. And when you are starting a project, you don't just have one idea. Oh, I know how to do it. Let's do this. You have lots of ideas, and you validate them, test them, and let them earn the right to have more resources through these kill gates. You can go read up on stage gate theory more. And the best game designers I've ever worked with use this same process. And it turns out while you're validating your ideas, who you listen to can determine if you thrive or fail. If you listen to everybody, or if you listen to the wrong people, you will build the wrong product. Now, many years ago, a scientist from Bell Labs published Diffusions of Innovation, which is a data-driven theory that essentially says innovations don't start with the majority. Innovations start with early adopters and innovators. It's how innovation spreads in any society or culture. 30 years later, Jeffrey Moore wrote Crossing the Chasm. How many of you have heard of or read Crossing the Chasm? Anybody? Yeah, awesome. Great book. And he wrote this book about how exactly the same theory, he took Everett Rogers' data and said, guess what? It's really hard to go from your early adopters to your early majority. He wrote this about turning the Apple II, before it was a hit, when it was just a hobbyist computer, wrote this book about turning it into a major hit. Important thing to note, He turned a hobbyist hit into a major hit. You cannot cross the chasm unless you delight this early market first. It's one of the most common and costly mistakes entrepreneurs make. That's all about who you listen to first. And remember, who you listen to first isn't your eventual audience. Who you listen to first is your beachhead that gets you to that bigger audience. And discovery is all about finding those people. So we always start every project by slicing off a narrow slice of the existing audience or the presumed audience. And this works in gamification projects in Malaysia, just like it works with my startup projects here in Silicon Valley. And what you do is find people who offer you increasing value over time. More on that in a moment. After you find the right people and you understand their context, their motivation, and their unmet needs, you work on design and you infuse your design with that knowledge, which is key. Kathy Sierra. How many of you have heard of Kathy Sierra or read her amazing books? She's the godmother of thinking smart about this stuff. And she likes to say, upgrade your user, not your product. Those of you in L&D, I think you totally embrace this. But it's really about structuring your experience, whatever domain it's in, to help your customer make progress in a way they care about. One way to do that works for people that aren't expert game designers, because not everybody is to use a mastery path framework, which is the core of our framework, and build an experience that gets better as your customers become more skilled. This is not that easy to do, but things like Duolingo do a great job of it. And by the way, the magic in Duolingo is not in the game mechanics, although they're awesome. The magic in Duolingo is in the learning path. It's in the quality of the exercises that get harder over time. That's actually the hard part. And that's what they did extraordinarily well. That's how it helps you become more skillful. So to understand what a mastery path is, let's take a look at Slack. How many of you have used Slack? Who's familiar with Slack? I hope quite a few of you, yeah. So you're going to be familiar with a lot of this, but I want you to pay attention to the last two phases, okay? And think about how it applies to your projects. So the first phase is discovery, where somebody hasn't bought in yet, and they're just finding out about your app, your L&D thing, whatever it is, your game. Discovery is for turning visitors into users. Slack's discovery tends to be very social. You get pulled in by another person. Sometimes your IT person assigns it to you at a larger company, but especially when Slack was first taking off, the way people discovered Slack was very similar to how you might discover Minecraft or some other new game. For onboarding, Slack does something very interesting. Onboarding is all about showing newbies the rope. Onboarding is not the same thing as your 30-day experience. But for onboarding, Slack, which is a multiplayer or social product, created a single player onboarding experience with a friendly bot to show you the ropes, so you would know just enough that you didn't make a fool of yourself when you're in the multiplayer experience or the chat channel. That structure is right out of gaming. How many of you have ever played a console game where level one, your first experience with interacting with bots before you got into the multiplayer fray? They knew that, and they didn't put the trappings of games in the interface. They put the underlying structure into the product. Habit building in Slack is really all about making Slack more and more your own. You use Slack, you enjoy it, it's chat, you learn emojis, but how do you get better at it? Through customizing, through learning all the details of it. You don't learn it all at once. It unfolds over time around the habit that you build. And the mastery is interesting. Slack has a through line. Slack's through line is about customization. Slack is a very customizable tool. And so what does mastery mean in Slack? Mastery might mean launching your own channel after you've used someone else's and got used to it. You can even program a welcome bot for your new channel, or keep going and integrate your app into the Slack ecosystem. So design is all about not designing the whole 9 yards. Design is about thinking about the journey you're going to take your customer on, thinking about the mental model that your experience has, thinking about the story unfolding in your customer's head, not necessarily the story in your app. Your app may or may not have a narrative, a story, as we talked about in the last session. But every product unfolds some story in the customer's head. And that's actually the most important story, the story your customer tells themselves about what your app means to them and what role it plays in their life over time. So how do you learn about that? How do you figure that out? You validate. Thank you. You mentioned validate earlier. You guys are ahead of the curve. So paper prototyping, early validation is all about what this quote says. Architects, gamification professionals, game designers, we all have the same job. We want to use an eraser on the drafting table rather than a sledgehammer on the construction site. We want to figure things out before we've built it. So how do you do that? You prototype to learn, not prototype to prove your idea is right. You don't fall in love with your idea. That's part of what stage gate theory gives you. It gives you a methodology to force you not to fall in love with your idea. You fall in love with solving a problem and learning from your customers. So back to Replica, what did we do? Well, we recruited a narrow slice of Superfans from our existing communities. That was fantastic. That let us move fast. And we tested very rough early versions of ideas. They looked something like this. And we storyboarded not the app itself, but people using the app in a context. And that kind of storyboarding of your day 1 to day 30 experience, think of that, it's a version of paper prototyping. Showing people using your experience over time is probably the smartest, fastest way to validate an idea and iterate quickly and learn not just if your idea itself is good, but if your assumptions about how people will use it are also good. Here's an example. One of the things we learned when we were testing it, we had pictures of people like sitting in their apartment. One of the people we were testing said, you know, I have a long commute and I pretty much just use Replica during my commute. I don't use it at home. Incredibly valuable to know. We learned it because they were reacting to our sketches. Then a part of validation that goes beyond just do paper prototypes is creating a strategic roadmap. Any of you who are responsible for product development, you know about what a roadmap is. There's a million ways to do a roadmap. If you want to do a roadmap for lasting engagement from the ground up, this is what you do. You first say, okay, here's the customer journey, whatever your customer journey looks like. This is what it is. And then you map that against your developer journey. This is our journey as developers, as creators. We start with an idea. There's some sort of MVP, beta, launch, and expansion, because launch is usually not the end of it, right? All right, what do? Start here. This is the non-intuitive thing. Every hit I worked on did this. Let's take a look. Slack. Slack started with a core learning loop. They didn't start with fancy onboarding and all kinds of levels of mastery. They started by really honing the core experience. So did Rock Band. We spent 7 months working on one frigging song, just getting the feedback right, getting the feel of the song right. It was crazy making, but it worked. So did The Sims. We did a lot of small experiments up front, but then once we found the fun, as it were, found our direction, our mental model, we really started honing that core loop. So did Covet Fashion. So did Happify. Noticing a pattern? This is a hot tip that you can take away and integrate into your work. If you're building something, you're building some sort of experience that you want to drive long-term engagement. That's the goal. That's the business model. Start with your day 21 habit. Don't start with onboarding. Don't get lost in all the fun of designing mastery levels. That's a newbie move. This is what experts do. This is where they start because it's the hardest part. And if you can get it right, you're gold. So let's review briefly. You start with discovery. You discover both the core value prop and idea and the audience you're going to target. Run tiny low fidelity experiments, not huge things, paper prototyping, sketches, that sort of thing, to develop your beachhead and really find out, are we on the right path? There's design. You want to make sure you're focused on delighting with the design, your hardcore superfans, not the everybody's. and you want to solve a real problem for a small group of people. That's what led Slack pivot from a failing multiplayer game to a hugely successful communication tool. And then you want to validate. You want to create a vision of a journey. What is your journey? How are things going to change over time? And build it around an existing habit. Part of the power of doing the discovery and finding a narrow slice of hot core customers is that you can integrate what you're doing with their existing habit. I just told you an example of learning that people were going to use it during the app during their commute, for instance. That's an existing habit, and you can actually optimize your experience around that. For instance, making sure videos they're going to watch are downloadable in case they don't have access to Wi-Fi on the commute. Those would be an example of how you would optimize something. And once you're able to do that, your job of getting somebody to stick, building habits that stick, gets much, much easier. And once you've sketched out those ideas, playtest your idea in rough form. Don't fall into the trap of making beautiful high-res screenshots to playtest with. That will give you false positives. It will ruin your ability to truly get the value you could get from those playtests. And then use a roadmap like this to communicate with your team, with your clients, with all your stakeholders, the order in which you want to bring your ideas to life. If you do it in this order, starting, it doesn't mean you have no onboarding, but it means you really start by focusing here. And then as you move to beta and launch, you're going to focus more on those front end things. At launch, you're going to need your discovery really working. That's launch. But it doesn't need to be so polished earlier. And that's, again, one of the big mistakes people make, that if you learn how not to make it, you will be ahead of the game as a product creator who can help teams build habits that stick. These are the 3 habits of successful innovators I learned from working with these amazing people and teams. And now you've learned them too. To apply these ideas, make sure to grab your free handout. And I've also given you a special exclusive discount just for conference holders on our next program, if you want to go deeper. Once a quarter, we run a 5-day online innovation bootcamp. It's like a super workshop that shows you how to use these tools and gives you templates to make using them faster and easier. The next one is December 7th through 11th. You can find out about it at gamethinking.io/bootcamp, and you can get a discount with the code that's in your handout, if that's something that you want to dig deeper on. Now, I would like to take questions, and I'd love to hear from you how these ideas land and what you think you might want to do with them.
Fantastic. Thank you, Amy Jo. That was amazing. What a masterclass, absolute masterclass. I wish I'd learned all of that.
I wish I'd learned it 20 years ago. I would have saved a lot of time.
Looking at it. So I'm just going to run through a couple of questions. We haven't got time for too many, but just a couple. So in terms of selling these, so there's someone here who's a who understands it and agrees with design thinking, game design, but is struggling to sell this to somebody else. What advice can you give them for selling it to, say, a learning and development manager? These are the tools and techniques they should use.
That is such a good question. That comes up a lot. So in general, it depends whether you're running an agency or you're working internally. And it depends how long you've been at your job. Okay. If you're new to a job or you have a new manager, you really want to understand how they do things first before trying to sell anything. What I tell people in general about selling it is, you need to, first of all, don't sell it unless you've learned it yourself. Like, you need to, first of all, this is a non-trivial toolkit and set of applications. This is not magic pixie dust. It is hard work. So to sell it, the first thing you need to do is get a win or two under your belt with the methodology for real. That's just no question. How can you do that? Apply it to your own work. Sign up for coaching with me, buy my book and do it yourself. I have had so many people buy my book, email me and said, oh my God, That was so useful. I executed everything in it. I welcome that, but we have programs to help you. You have to execute it and try it and get a win under your belt to sell it. So that's thing number one, is do the work. Get 1 or 2 wins, find a pet project yourself. Try it out yourself on a client project. You don't sell it to the client. These are tools that you integrate into your own methodology, and then it's just the way you do things. Like, I never sell this effectively to clients. I talk to them about how we do things. And then we have numerous case studies of how people use these tools to find success. That's what sells them. It's the case studies. So I don't really think it's possible to sell it without you first getting a win by doing the work with your tools. Good. Once you've done that, so let me just say, once you've done that, then the way to sell it is you sell the results they can get. And you can reference, my results, you can reference your results, but you're really selling the results. And you need to sell the whole, like, something that happens a lot is people say, oh my gosh, I love your stuff so much. But, people come to me and they always need it yesterday and they just want me to build the thing. They just say, here's this L&D thing, just build the thing. We don't have enough time for you to do all this research stuff. I hear this over and over again. That is a problem with how you've positioned yourself. Like, I can't solve that problem for you. If you run an agency and you've positioned and you take last minute, throw it together work, that's what you're going to do. You need to be able to, as an agency, as an individual in your company, communicate leadership. So, you need to have some sort of leadership and say, look, I know how to do this. This is the kind of results we get. We need to carve out a month on this project for scoping and testing. And if we don't, we will fail. There's a lot more to it. And again, we have a program where I coach people on how to do it. One of our clients just got a new job at a hot fintech startup that's about to go public. And I'm doing a lot of coaching with her about how to get good work done, but not rock the boat at her new job. It's a delicate balance.
No, I think that's great advice. Thank you. I want to just a little bit of time at the end just to get everybody together again. So just one last question, if I may. Just that point where you confirm the desperate need of the target audience. What are the flags that you look for? The signposts you say, yep, I've got it. That's something they really need.
That's a great question. So it's iterative. So we look for directional signposts. There's not necessarily like we're done. It's very much iterative. Some of the things we look for are, we do a 3-stage process. It's called the Superfan funnel. The first thing we have is a screener. It's only 6 questions. It's bait for early adopters. The second thing are speed interviews, 5 to 10 minute interviews. That tops. The third thing is a play test where we play test storyboards. During all those stages, we look for signals. At the first stage in the screener, we look for people that have thoughtful and interesting answers to our open-ended questions. We have multiple choice and open-ended. And that's the first trigger. It's like, oh, and if we don't get any of those, we're probably probing the wrong channel. The second thing we look for in 5-minute interviews is body language and verbal language. The body language we look for are leaning forward, pupils dilating, true interest. You can see it in people's body language. And we're not pitching an idea at that point. We're just talking to them about their need. And we're probing to get at it. We also look for certain language that comes out of their mouths. We look for things like, I've been looking for something like that. We look for language around, we ask them, what are you doing right now to try and solve the problem that we're, validating that you have? Lots of people can say they have a problem. Oh yeah, I have that problem. How do you know they have a problem? So we look for them telling us in the last 2 months, actions they've taken to try and solve the problem. That differentiates the early adopters. There's more, but that's one really good tip.
Fantastic. So this is game design, gamification design gold. So thank you so much, Amy Jo. So do go to gamethinking.io, take her up on that offer, and definitely download the handout. So thank you so much, Amy Jo, for joining us, and hope you enjoy the rest of your Thanksgiving.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Great.